Iran has used the extension of talks to undertake three separate campaigns. First, to continue splitting the international coalition against it, as long as it offers talks, Russia and China, and to an extent Europe, and to an extent some people in the United States will say there's no need for additional pressure because that could compel Iran to cease negotiations entirely. Secondly, Iran uses this time to build up its nuclear program, which in essence provides it with a deck of cards it can then play against potential concessions that might be demanded in the future. And finally, there's no real consequence for what Iran is doing now. So it's able to show this record of defiance to its own people that shows that Iran is a much more powerful state, and also to show that to states in the region that Iran is not something that the United States, Europe, Russia, or China is willing to push back against.
Right. So let's talk about those consequences. As we mentioned, the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, the defense minister, Benny Gantz, going to Washington, wants to hear if Washington has a real plan B against Iran. Do you believe the Biden administration has those plans and maybe more importantly, is ready to apply them if needed?
Well, first, it's a very good thing that Director Barnea and Minister Gantz and his team will be in Washington. This demonstrates clearly that communications between Washington and Israel are quite good, and our security services, which have always worked well together, continue to do so. However, it's unlikely that they're going to see any significant change in the Biden administration. First, the United States and Israel share a vast amount of intelligence, so we have a common operating picture for the situation. It's more likely that the Israeli team will hear that the United States believes further negotiations are necessary, pressure is required, and that failure to do so will prevent the Biden administration from bringing a reluctant Europe on board for those additional steps.
All right. Well, that's not a message that certainly Israel will want to be hearing. I want to address your presence there in the Gulf, Norman, because we know those countries there, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, have much at stake in this process, maybe even more so than Israel. I'm curious what you're hearing here and the importance of maybe the Biden administration hearing their voices as well on this issue as hearing those of Israel.
The Biden administration has undertaken a number of senior TDYs to the region, senior visits by its Iran leadership and its military leadership, and local leaders have been quite clear. Iran's actions in the region have faced no significant international pressure. Iran has faced no significant penalties for what it's doing on its nuclear program, and the Biden administration's performance in Afghanistan and the sense that it's pulling out of the region, it seems to be empowering Iran and causing local countries to have to make different decisions as to how they will handle the region for their own security. There is a need for international collective security in this region, and there's a sense that the Europeans, Russia, China, and even the United States are not willing to perform that capacity to the extent they were in the past.
Well, let me ask you then, because then that raises the question of what is Israel's plan B, its alternatives, if that scenario is that you described it. A lot of discussion. I mean, does Israel realistically have a military option, or Israel and even some of those other nations that we've just discussed there, if the U.S. is not going to take an active part in some kind of military option against Iran's nuclear program?
Well, I wouldn't presume to speak for the government of Israel or its extraordinary security and intelligence personnel, but I think the way I would look at this is that Israel, over the years, has developed, and now we're watching in other countries the development of an array, sort of a menu of options and resources that can be brought forward to address this problem. I think if some people look at this, they see a solution to this being a couple of aircraft that shoot across the sky and drop a bomb of some sort. I don't see that as the type of conflict that may be in front of us. In fact, it may not be a short conflict. It could be a multi-phased conflict, something that's needed to prevent Iran from moving forward. The question your viewers should ask is, what would be that red line? What is the indicator of something that Israel or the region simply could not permit? And I think that's a political decision that would have to be made by the government at the time.
Well, let me ask you just your opinion, Norman. What would be a reasonable red line for those countries that are, let's say, directly in the line of fire, that face an existential threat from Iran if it develops nuclear weapons capability? What would that red line be?
Well, first, we're looking at Iran undertaking a series of activities currently, which many would have thought would have passed that red line a decade ago. The fabrication of uranium metal, the production of 60% enriched uranium, the construction of very complicated arrays of cascades, which are designed to produce highly enriched uranium very quickly. And of course, activities at Fordow, an underground facility, which has no apparent purpose other than a weaponization program. I think the issue would be if Israel or another country acquired information, or if the Iranians simply announced they're building a weapon. Now, if they come close, or if they just build various parts of their program and do this temporarily, I think that would provoke a political debate. But it will come down to acquiring good information and perhaps an Iranian public decision.
All right, then we'll have to see if that happens, or it may not be even too late. As in the North Korea case, we saw how sometimes those things can accelerate quickly and turn out to be an unpleasant surprise. Norman Roule, thank you for joining us again on I-24 News.
You're welcome.